Today's video is very appropriate right now because I have just got back from Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is one of my favorite countries to visit, and I'm lucky enough that that was my third time visiting. So, as you can imagine, I'm also very obsessed with reading books all set in Sri Lanka. And today I have 10 books, all set in Sri Lanka, mostly written by Sri Lankans. These books all cover a range of fiction, historical fiction, autobiography, and a non-fiction travel log, which I have mentioned before, and it's really fascinating. Today might be interrupted a little bit because I'm currently fostering two very cute ginger kittens. So let's see if they manage not to cry all the way through. The first book on my list is called Chai Time in Cinnamon Gardens by Shankari Chandran. Now, this book is actually quite interesting because it's not set in Sri Lanka. The majority of the story takes place in Australia, and it centers around a Sri Lankan immigrant family who all own a nursing home. It is a fascinating, interesting story in itself that encompasses some really, really big issues such as racism, trauma, memory, and the search for identity and trying to fit in when you're an immigrant in a new country. It sets contemporary times in Australia. The family are all Tamils, and so there are links with Sri Lanka, with the Civil War, and one of the characters within it clearly has some trauma from what happened during the Civil War in Sri Lanka, which only officially ended in 2009. So we are talking about very, very recent history. It's really worth reading, whether you're interested in Sri Lanka or not, because it says a lot about racial issues. There are parts of the book, some chapters, that are set from the point of view of the person who was being racist. So I think that's quite interesting, turning on its head in an attempt to understand where that comes from, why the white residents are feeling like that in this area of Australia. And it's just a really good, moving storyline. It covers several different generations within the nursing home that is run by this Sri Lankan family. It also brings up the question of statues of colonizers and issues to do with that. So I thought that was really interesting and felt very on point from a lot of things that have been discussed in the last few years, certainly in the UK. I learned a lot from this book about the way that people deal with racism, about what people go through, about the racism in Australia. It felt quite centred on how it's specifically about racist incidents in Australia. While it has the Sri Lankan Civil War and history as a backdrop, it doesn't totally centre it because it was all set during more modern day. But there's definitely a lot about grief there, about loss, about losing your homeland, and I really recommend it for anyone interested in Sri Lanka, Australia, history, or books about race as well. My book number 2, I have mentioned once before in my non-fiction 25 book selection, which you can watch here if you haven't watched. It is called The Elephant Complex by John Gimlett. Now, this is not written by a Sri Lankan. However, John Gimlett spent a lot of time traveling around Sri Lanka, and as he encounters different people, from cricketers to politicians to former freedom fighters, he interviews them and then introduces us to that area of Sri Lankan history, Sri Lankan current affairs as well. It's a really great all-encompassing non-fiction book that I really recommend to anyone who wants to visit Sri Lanka or is interested in Sri Lanka, because it's such a good explanation of the history, the people there. It is called The Elephant Complex, so there's a lot about elephants as a symbol of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is one of the best places to see wild elephants, and you can see wild elephants even when you're not looking for them in Sri Lanka. So I love that section of the story. They were talking a lot about these ancient elephant corridors, which are when the elephants kind of walk across certain areas of jungle again and again on their regular routes, and it ties in a lot with memory as well. It's a huge book, so definitely don't go into it thinking it will be a short read, but there's so much learning there, so many takeaways. Sometimes I think that to be able to write a less biased version of history, sometimes perhaps it needs to be an outsider to the country. That's one of the questions that actually have been discussed when I was at university, and I did a whole section on history and languages and who should be the writer of the history of the country. And there were quite a lot of things that said being an outsider can be quite beneficial for a number of reasons, particularly when it comes to Sri Lanka, because it was so divided in terms of what happened during the Civil War, and no one was left untouched by the atrocities that happened. Number 3 is Anil's Ghost by Michael Ondaatje. Michael Ondaatje is probably best known for his book The English Patient, which happens to be one of my favourite films. His style of writing, it's really, really beautiful. And this story, again, is a set post Civil War period in Sri Lanka, and it centres around a character who is a forensic anthropologist, and they are going and travelling around Sri Lanka to uncover bodies and the people that have kind of been disappeared and murdered during the time of all of the atrocities. It therefore covers a lot of human rights violations that happened at the time, a lot of the abuses, obviously references a lot of the current trauma that is happening there. And it really made me think of this one experience that I had when I was in Cambodia. And near Phnom Penh, there's an area called the Killing Fields, which was where mass genocide happened. One of the things that happens is every time it floods during monsoon season, parts of people sometimes and material and bones start to rise again, and it's almost like the country is telling you, you cannot forget this. And this book really brought that home to me as well, in the importance of remembering what has happened, because you cannot forget. It really brought on the importance of memory and how do countries and families cope with the things that have happened before in order to move forward. Really big questions that came out of this book. Number 4 is a book called When Memory Dies, written by a Sri Lankan called Ambalavana Sivanandan, who in my research for this BookTube video is quite a big name in the UK and has written a lot about race and class there after he left Sri Lanka as a refugee to flee the war and the ongoing issues that were happening there. One of the best lines in the book is, "When memory dies, a people die." So it's written as a fictional story, which is multi-generational. It spans from around the 1920s to the 1980s, so doesn't reach the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War. But it talks a lot about the run-up to that and the different minority groups that were involved. So not only the Sri Lankan Tamils, but also the Indian immigrants that had come from India previously, and how they were treated and oppressed during the British colonization of Sri Lanka, what happened when Sri Lanka got their independence from the British, and everything kind of as a knock-on effect of that. So it really threads in beautifully these parts of history that sometimes we just focus on, oh, okay, the Civil War happened between these dates, but it actually goes back and explains what happened, why those tensions were there, and I think that's vital to understanding things like civil wars, and I think that's vital to understanding any country and its history. Book number 5 is called The 7 Moons of Mali Almeida, written by Shehan Karunatilaka. This book is one of the most unusual books I've ever read in terms of its narration, and I'm actually going to do a whole BookTube video on unusual narrators. I've got some great ones on there, so subscribe if you're interested in that in the future. This book is all narrated by someone who has just died, potentially murdered, and they are a ghost in this kind of limbo afterlife, and they are wandering around parts of Sri Lanka trying to find out what happened to them. It's really quirky in terms of parts of the afterlife. It brings in a lot of ideas about Buddhism. There are some things about creatures and monsters there, and the backdrop is the most recent history of Sri Lanka and the Civil War, as the main character was a war photographer. It's a very important part of it is he's trying to find the photos that he took that showed accountability for atrocities on certain sides of the Sri Lankan war. It's fascinating in that it ties in a lot of characters who represent other countries. So there's a character who's a member of the CIA there. There's lots of mentions about the Communist Party and communism, and the whole story itself is just, it's a bit bonkers, but you go with it because it's so fascinating and unusual. I'd love to know if you've read this book and if you enjoyed it or not. I think I started reading it and I was like, okay, this is very strange. I don't know where this is going, because he's a ghost and he's kind of trying to whisper to the people who are still living and following them around and try and work out how he was murdered and who did that to him, and protect these photographs. So it's really interesting. Let me know. Number 6 is written by a Sri Lankan writer called Roma Turn, who wrote a book called Mosquito. This one is really beautifully done because it's a love story that happens between two characters in Sri Lanka, and how their love and their romance is affected by the Civil War and the things that are happening at the time. Mentions a lot about Colombo and the fear of bombings that lots of people lived with there. It was a really good fictional way into the Civil War. So I think I would probably recommend that one to start with if you haven't read any of the other ones on the list yet. Number 7. This is the book that I have read most recently because I read it 2 weeks ago during my time when I was traveling around Sri Lanka. It is called A Passage North by Anuk Arud Pragasam. This was a really beautiful, slow book. I think some of the other books I mentioned, it's a bit more fast-paced, thrilling, and this one is very meditative, very mellow. Not that much happens across the actual course of the book, but it is one man from a Tamil family who lives in Colombo, spent time in India, much like the author himself, and somebody dies who's connected to the family, and it's all about him traveling to the north to a funeral, and that's kind of the main action that happens. But underneath all that is this backdrop of grief for things that have happened. A lot about his grandmother and her dementia, so it covers a lot of more, I guess, topics like that. I walked along Marine Drive, which is one of the walks that the character does in Colombo in Sri Lanka, and I was thinking a lot about this book and how it's really beautiful when you can just really enjoy a book and it doesn't even have that much action in it, but there's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes. As you can imagine, it touches a lot on trauma that happened during the war. One of the main characters lost family members, and it's a lot about him coming to terms with that. And there's also mention of the atrocities and torture and things that happened that can be quite upsetting. So just a note on that if you are going to read it, which I do recommend because there's a lot of learning and a lot of takeaways, and quite a peaceful read for a book that has kind of war as a backdrop, I would say. I'd love to know if you've read it. Let me know your take on it if you have in the comments below. Number 8 is a bit more of light relief compared with some of the books that I mentioned on my list. It is called The Tea Planter's Daughter by Anna McLeod Trotter. This is a fairly fluffy-hearted historical romance set in the tea plantations in Sri Lanka. It does touch on things like race. There's a big twist that happened towards the end of the book, which really blew my mind, and I learned a lot from it, but I can't say what it is because I don't want to give away the twist. It is set during the time of British colonization, so there's a lot of things about oppression, but it very much centers the British family on the tea plantation, so quite a lot from the colonial viewpoint in this historical romance, which I was just thinking, I don't read romance books very often, so there's one, there we go. Okay, number 9 is a book called Reef by Ramesh Gunasekara. It's a fictional story, and it's all about a young man called Titan who goes to work in a big house for a man called Mr. Salgado. And it's kind of like a coming of age story of Triton as he is immersed in this kind of cultural, celebrated world of Mr. Salgado, who has ideals about the world, and it is called Reef, so there's mention of marine biology and oceanography, although I do remember not as much as I would have liked there to be as a wannabe marine biologist myself. But it is quite interesting. There's quite a lot in it about class and classism during the time period that it's set, and as always there's the political landscape and things that are going on in the background, mentions about the Communist Party, what's happening there during this book and what's happening there at the time. And my final book is number 10. This is a autobiography by someone with a pen name called Niromi D'Souza, and it is called Tamil Tigress. Now, this is an autobiography of a young woman who was about 16, a child soldier who joined up with the Tamil Tigers, who were fighting for freedom in Sri Lanka, and went on to be known as one of the most brutal terrorist groups in history. They had very severe punishments if you disobeyed, and how it talks about how she became caught up in this, how it was very difficult not to become caught up in the Tigers if you were a Tamil family, because you were affected by everything, constant oppression that was happening by the Sri Lankan army at the time to any people who happened to be Tamil, whether or not they were supporters of the Tigers, because there was a deep assumption that you would be just because you happened to be Tamil. It talks a lot about how it affected her family. It was really interesting thinking about this book again, because I recently was talking to my students about extremism. They were about 14 or 15, and they were asking me, oh, well, why would people do that? Why would people want to hurt others? And I think this book does a fantastic job of showing you this is how someone can lead into having those extreme views of knowing that you would betray your own family for a cause, and that cause and how it became all important and all encompassing to the fact that you would potentially kill anyone who disagreed with you. And it's a really, really good example of the ideology that goes on behind that. This author, she actually lives in Australia as a refugee and cannot go back to Sri Lanka because of the activities that she did during the Civil War when she was part of the Tigers. And I really recommend it for anyone interested in Sri Lankan history, but also anyone interested in extremism and that balance between a freedom fighter and terrorist group, and a lot to learn from it about the world and how ideologies can manifest and turn more and more extreme over time, and how that can become disenchanted as well with everything that happens, and how things are almost always taken too far and too violent and too extreme. So yeah, I'd love to know if you've read it. I don't hear many people referencing it or talking about it, so do let me know if you've read that. Thank you so much for listening. Up soon I have my book recommendations for India, and I also will talk about my month 2 on YouTube and how my YouTube growth is going so far.